we have a long time listener, and at one point they were like a stringer for us at in Fukuyama. This show's been on for a while, and he taught me that there are no natural disasters, that nature happens and disasters are a function of our capacity to be prepared for them. And that really struck me in your book, because that's sort of one of the themes that of your book is where we were when we got hit as a society by this once in a lifetime pandemic, knock on wood, once in a lifetime pandemic, and how it sort of exacerbated and showed that. Let's start with that sort of basic premise, and then we'll obviously go from there.
Yeah, so I'm a social scientist, and for 20 some years, my work has been motivated by this idea that crises reveal things. If we look closely at crises, we learn who we are, we learn what we value, we learn whose lives matter. And in 2020, we obviously had a cascading set of crises: the pandemic, attacks on democracy, the hollowing out of cities, economic collapse, lots of crises. But we also saw societies around the world respond very differently and with different kinds of outcomes. And one of the things that I became clear about over the course of the work on this book is the American crisis was so much worse than it needed to be, not only in terms of the death and disease, which is the main thing we've talked about for good reason, but also the distrust, the division, the long-term fracturing of the notion of society that really kind of was obviously there before 2020, but accelerated, intensified, hardened. That affects us to this day. And I think one of the reasons why everyone is so on edge in 2024 is we lived through 2020 and we haven't processed it at all.
I want to return to some of those things. And I should also say that the book is sort of, I guess, clothesline with almost like an ethnography of 7 New Yorkers from different boroughs, plus one who passed away, told through his son, as a way of sort of like getting into those stories and then sort of these broader assessments. But let's start with this. When I remember, I don't know, it was the 13th. I know it was March 13th because that was the day that the schools closed. And my son had a birthday on March 7th. And we were at a bouncy castle in Sunset Park. And I told these guys, I'm like, I think this is the last time you guys are going to be doing this for a while. And they're like, oh, no, don't worry about it. I mean, I was worried because I had brought hand sanitizers because we were reading about this.
Yeah.
But shortly after everything, the school closed, I started trying to read stuff about the last pandemic, and it's fascinating. You read a little bit, and the big theme is nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to write about it. There was nobody who did, even as far as I can tell, what you did in this moment in terms of the ethnography. Talk both about why you did what you did, but also that notion of like, people don't want to
think about it.
Yeah, one of the best books about the 1918 influenza pandemic is called America's Forgotten Pandemic by historian Alfred Crosby, written many decades after the event. And it's an account of, what I've come to think of in my work as the will not to know, the strong will not to know about things, which characterizes, so many features of our life, but really our relationship to pandemics. And I guess it was knowing about this pattern that made me want to dive in while I saw everyone else turning their backs. And I guess I understand the turning our back part of it too. Let's remember, it was a very scary time to be alive. I think there are a lot of people, let's be clear, a lot of people are dealing with kind of fundamental threats to their basic, security regularly. And we're living through an atrocity at the moment where a lot of people are concerned about extreme violence and vulnerability. But for billions of people, I think 2020 and this threat it posed was existential, right? You didn't know if you were going to survive. You didn't know if your parents were going to survive or if you'd see them again. You didn't know if you'd have your job back when the thing ended. You remember in March, we didn't really know if our kids were going to be okay. And the book opens, with my son was 13 at the time. And in the beginning of March, he had this fever that spiked and he couldn't get off the couch and he had night sweats and it kept on going. And we thought he had COVID, but we weren't going to take him to the hospital and we didn't know what to do. And it was terrifying, right? And so I think one reason that we turn away from the pandemic and we have trouble dealing with it is like, just at a human level, there was a lot of stuff to manage. And I think our attitude has been like, let's just power through this somehow, do what we can, and then act like it hasn't happened. And because I've done work in this area for so long, on these kinds of issues, I really was aware that what we're living through was profound and that it was going to be hard for people to register all of the traumas. It was just so many things so quickly. And I thought, well, here I am, I might as well. And I was able to quickly organize a team of researchers at NYU, and we kind of fanned out, like paying attention to different parts of the world. And initially I thought, I'd kind of cover everything that I could globally, and it became clear I couldn't travel. So I decided to kind of spend my time focusing on the big picture story, but also through these deep accounts of 7 individuals in New York, which happened to be the big global hotspot. And through their stories, I think we get a chance to process what we live through, which I think we really need to do.
Let's talk about how we fared relative to other countries, because you write that both that A, we were in many respects an outlier experience, and B, that many Americans don't realize that we were outlier experience. In what ways were, both in terms of what we did as a response and in terms of how it impacted us and how we reacted, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to know going in is that we started 2020 as an outlier on the positive side. Global health agencies that rank national capacity to deal with pandemics had ranked the US as more prepared for a pandemic than any other country on earth. We had an amazing, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, some really strong health infrastructure in place, incredible expertise at managing crises, capacity to mobilize resources, because there's a lot of wealth in this country if you want to do something, access to technology. Like the assessment going in was that we would be well suited. And of course, what happened is we dramatically underperformed. So the US it was not the deadliest place on earth. There are other countries that had higher rates of disease and higher rates of death, but we rank among the poorest performing countries in the world, especially at our level of affluence. And this is especially true in 2020. And so, like in the beginning of the book, I look at the initial responses of several countries that are like the US, including the UK and Australia. And I like to talk about Australia here because in 2020, they have a right-wing prime minister, Scott Morrison. They've just had these incredible wildfires, bushfires, they call them. And he was denying that they had anything to do with climate change, right? He's a science denier. They were polarized. There's high levels of distrust. And Australia looks like it's set up to go just about the way the US goes. And instead, Morrison says, in this kind of country that's got a federalist system, I'm going to bring together the leaders of every state and territory and the health experts. We're going to have this kind of special cabinet group that's going to get the best science and lead us through this crisis with regular meetings. And over the course of the year, they have some protests because the lockdowns were trying and challenging. But Australia's death rate is actually lower than it is during a typical year in 2020. In fact, if the US had the same death rate from COVID as Australia, 900,000 Americans would be alive today.
That's 80% of the deaths would be inhibited. I can't do the math, but somewhere in that neighborhood.
It's a staggering number, right? It's a staggering number of people who would still be alive. But the other thing that's really amazing about Australia is that by the end of 2020, levels of trust in government, in scientists, and in other people go up in Australia, and they go the other direction in the US. And here's another area where the US is such an outlier. There are a lot of failures that we could point to in this book. And I want to tell you, like, every time I brought up the name of the 45th president, my eyes started to glaze over a little bit, because, like, at some level, who needs to recount all of that horrible stuff we went through? But it is worth pulling out the nuggets there, because, like, people forget, for instance, that, in the beginning of the pandemic, there was real concern about China and whether China was releasing all the information that it could be releasing to world health leaders and to the World Health Organization. Was China trying to suppress information to make the thing kind of go away, not knowing what would happen? And Trump, who prided himself on being so tough on China, look at his public statements, which are in the book and in the social media. He was incredibly trustful. Like, I've talked to the Chinese and they seem to have everything under control. And here in the United, there's all this magical thinking that you got from Trump. Like, it's going to go away by Easter, or I like the numbers where they are, so I'm not going to.
That was the Diamond Princess. You outlined the difference between the Diamond Princess, which is a cruise liner that left from Japan and returned to Japan, and one the Grand Princess from San Francisco, where people were kept, where he kept people off. I mean, I think, like, so much of this is memory hold because it was so overwhelming. Right. But there was, I mean, this is really ultimately what I think you find too, is there was no leadership. There was a total abdication of leadership in this moment.
I think people don't necessarily recognize the extent of the dysfunction and chaos from the federal government. And I think it actually begins in the mind of Trump. Like, the dysfunction and the chaos in his mind meant that we had such an undisciplined response. And there's all kinds of capacity that the US had that we never really had a chance to use. So, like, for instance, rather than using the power of the awesome power of the federal government to try to procure or produce or distribute masks and other PPE, or to produce and distribute ventilators, you might remember that Trump had his son-in-law take charge of this procurement process, and American states were bidding against each other to try to get vital medical equipment, which was driving the price up, right? I mean, it was a clown show. And
people forget this. I mean, I like, just to remind people that I think there were some states who anticipated having, like, a shipment come and then realized essentially it got sold out from underneath them to a higher state from a different state. Like, at one point, it felt like there were compacts between states that were sort of like becoming. It felt like for a couple of weeks there, like, are we gonna pull apart here and have this region versus that region?
How about Gavin Newsom feeling like he had to go and kiss the hand of the king in order to make sure that the federal government would supply the state of California with basic supplies? I mean, there's so much that's strange. One of the chapters in the book deals really closely with this question of, why is it that masks became so contentious in the US, whereas in most societies, either people wore them, like the societies that were affected by SARS in 2003, people just wore the mask before the definitive science showing that masks would help came in, because they knew that masks had worked for other coronaviruses in the past. And it turned out that if you have the right mask and you know how to wear it and you do it right, it's tremendously effective. And by the way, if you don't believe that, ask anybody who worked in a hospital during COVID, like how important were masks? They were very important at keeping hospital workers alive. But in the US, what happened is, when the CDC finally issued their proclamation that Americans should be wearing masks in public, it was April 3rd, and there was Trump who announced the policy change, and he says, like, as of today, the CDC wants all Americans to wear masks in public, and then he says this amazing thing. He says, personally, I'm not going to do it, and nobody knows how to interpret that message. Like, the CDC is telling us we should do it, I'm not going to do it, and you remember, like, now it becomes like an article of faith for everyone in the Trump inner circle. If you wear a mask, you're going to look weak and cowardly and scared. So bare your face in public, and that's your sign of fealty to this administration. You might recall Mike Pence goes to the Mayo Clinic.
Yes.
The Mayo Clinic, of all places. Like, you have to be very, very sick and in trouble to go to the Mayo Clinic, right? You go there when your doctors at home can't take care of you. And he refuses to wear a mask at the Mayo Clinic, right? And then
the amazing thing about that is that had he gone to the Mayo Clinic in some other time or instance and walk in on people that sick, he would have worn a mask,
of course,
for all of their benefits.
But the mask was no longer about health. The mask had suddenly become a symbol of one's political ideology. And Sam, let's be clear, like the Democrats did this too, right? So the next thing you know, every Democrat running for office changes their Facebook picture. So that's you got like Biden in a mask and Kamala Harris is doing TV ads with a mask on. And so if you're, walking in the streets in New York, as you might have been, and I was, and you see someone else with a mask, you had this feeling like, oh yeah, you're on my team. And look, I'm a mask wearer. I believe in them. It's a good health technology. But what's important for us to understand is it became something more than a health device. It became a symbol of our political commitment and ideology. And so the next thing you know, Americans, and nobody else on earth, by the way, is doing this. Americans are brawling in Walmart, in Costco, in trains and airplanes. Like, we are fighting each other. There are homicides over whether we're wearing masks. And I think this is so important because, like, it didn't need to be this way. There's nothing inherently ideological about a mask. In fact, in England, where people don't like to wear masks much, they don't have a history of it, rates of mask wearing were about the same as in the US, but it had nothing to do with your political ideology. At least at first, it was just like you either did it or didn't. We politicized it and turned it into yet another thing that divides us. And, first it was the mask, then it was what medication should you take, right? Like the left and the right had different medications. Then the left and right had different views about whether they should take the vaccine. Then the left and right had different views about whether the election was legitimate. Like, you can see this thing building up. And I think we're still living inside of this in a way that's far more powerful and far more powerfully linked to 2020 than our regular conversations acknowledge.
In terms of like the way that drove it, I mean, I remember in March, probably, like, people, and I'm more attuned to it because of this job, but like of right wingers going with a microphone and standing out in front of refrigerator trucks in New York City and saying, like, I don't hear that, they're not on, or like that. It was all some type of like crisis actor thing that was happening. And when we look at outcomes like, surge in homicides and in violent crime broadly during COVID, when we look at things like even you mentioned traffic deaths, like people drove more dangerously towards pedestrians at that point.
Yeah.
And we had also knock-on things like inflation, and we had the protests. But putting aside the inflation, maybe the protests also, on some level, are also a response, maybe just the flip side of the coin in some level, of like the sense that it was mayhem and anarchy in some way.
Well, a couple of things there. So, first of all, on the spike in violence, there's also a chapter in the book about this phenomenon, because it's so important for Americans to understand we are a massive outlier in the world. Like, what happens in most of the world in 2020 is, the kind of things shut down, people stay home, their engagement with other people in public goes down also, and crime rates plummet, and it stays that way, through the year. In the US, we have like a brief period where that happens in March and April, but when we come back, and after we've been politicized to think about like masks and medications and even basic science about whether this thing is real differently, we are incensed with one another. And gun crimes go up, and that to be expected, right? We're the ones who have all the guns in the United States, so it's no big surprise that homicide goes up by gun. But then all these other strange kinds of violence, right? Like vehicular homicide, vehicular manslaughter, road rage incidents, like there's all kinds of crime that has nothing to do with guns going up in the US. And I really take that as a barometer of the extent to which like we've become kind of dysfunctional at a civic level, and the extent to which our leadership has really pulled us apart. And then what happens is, there's another set of issues, which has to do with the murder of George Floyd, and this kind of incredible act of racial violence, and the act of solidarity that I think comes in the United States, where people start to bond together and say enough of this. I think the protests in the summer of 2020, which are historic civil rights demonstrations, something like 28 million people, come out in March, is linked to the fact that in March and April and May, Americans are watching not just a pandemic and not just dysfunction from the White House. They're seeing the inequalities related to this set of crises, right? We started the show by saying it's not a natural disaster, it's a social one. And we're seeing that Black and brown people are dying at a much higher level, that there's a class component to this, right? Remember essential workers, by the way? Remember like when—
Yeah, I wanted to get to that. I literally have that as next, but I wanted to stay on one thing. Is there any evidence that this spike in crime, and like you say, vehicular, homicides as well, and even just so-called pedestrian accidents, there a certain aggressiveness, which I think is, in part addresses this question I have for you. Is there any evidence that it was a change in policing? I mean, I've had people say like, it was a function of some type of, George Floyd effect. But we wouldn't really see that in vehicular homicides, would we? I mean,
yeah. So I do think that police in many cities said, like, okay, fine, we're just not going to do our job at this point. If you're going to complain about us murdering Black people, we're not going to do our job, which is an incredible thing, for police to say. But there was clearly a kind of withdrawal from police monitoring in a way that was pretty irresponsible, right? Where the police are walking away from basic civic protections as their version of protest against the protest, right? As their counter protest against people upset about police violence. But I also think the bigger thing is that what happened in the United States is that our leadership in 2020, and this is still with us, Trump, one of the things that Trump did is he unleashed and made legitimate all kinds of grievance and anger, and fueled the sense of anger, told Americans that they were being misserved, that they shouldn't trust each other, that the experts had it in for them. And America is a pretty individualistic place on a regular day. And I think in 2020, we turned almost hyper individualistic, right? It was like, take care of yourself. Gun sales spiked during 2020, right? People were arming themselves, like, take care of yourself and your family and forget about everybody else was kind of the ethic. And actually, the first thing I wrote in March of 2020, when the pandemic was starting, was this op-ed in the Times saying, we shouldn't talk about social distance. We need physical distance and social solidarity, right? It's solidarity that gets you through a crisis. The nations that did well in 2020 were able to build some kind of solidarity where they could support one another, not just take themselves as the only people who matter, but to take care of each other. And in the U.S., again, I think in great part because of our leadership, we went in the opposite direction. So for me, the kind of dangerous driving and people flouting these kind of really basic fundamental laws is an expression of this turn towards anger, individualism. I don't really care about the rest of you.
Nihilism, Eric, would that
nihilism is a great word for it.
Would that be? That's what the divide that I guess I observe, right? Where you have this divide between collectivism and then basically people thinking it's not just individualism. There's something darker there about how nothing really matters, and that's, I think, a lot of what the Trump, MAGA crowd embodied.
I think it's a great point. I mean, I think that we saw the nihilism. I've always thought that was a big force in the Trump electoral victory in 2016. This kind of burn it all down mentality. I don't need someone who's going to do basic government. I want to blow the thing up. And I think 2020 we saw this in a different way, and it's pathological, and it's a real danger to our sense of what it means to have a body politic or to think about the common good. And I think it fuels this kind of anger and energy that's out there, and that just got expressed in the United States in 2020, again, in ways that I think we don't recognize as unique, but should, because 2020 was a horrible year all over the world. I mean, COVID is a terrible disease, and it provoked all kinds of really difficult responses. The United States is not the only country where things went badly, but things went badly in a very specific way here. And one of the goals of my book was to both paint this picture of how the US differed from other places on earth, but then also to get inside of the kind of experiences of ordinary people. This is why I wound up writing about someone from every borough of New York, plus a Black Lives Matter activist and this subway worker who died early in the crisis. I think one way to get at these questions is to have our conversations about the big picture politics and policies, but the other is to really go deep into the more personal experiences so that we can kind of reconnect to the things in ourselves that we've repressed since that terrible year.